Okay, brilliant. We have judges, we have teams, we have coaches, we have a stopwatch. Brilliant, we have everything we need. So welcome everybody to round 5 of the Online World Schools Debating Championships 2020. Proposition we have Scotland, and opposition we have the Czech Republic. You all know the motion. And so without further ado, I'd like to call upon the first speaker for Team Scotland to open the case for the proposition. Here.
Today in London, you will find 22 empty homes for every homeless person. The private ownership of property has failed dismally. We already trust the state to own education, to own health and other vital needs. We think state ownership of something as vital as land ought to have been a natural extension to this. That is our stance on side proposition. A 3-part case from Team Scotland today. In my speech, 1, public land ownership would be invaluable in tackling inequality, and 2, why the motion makes the state far more able to enact large, beneficial infrastructure projects. In second, we will talk to you about why private land ownership presents a huge risk of financial crashes. But before I get into my substantive, a mechanism. So simply put, we prefer a world where a government was everybody's landlord in the same way that private landlords work right now. They would specify the purpose of all land, so some would be residential, some non-residential, some arable, etc. Leases would be flexible, but we think around 10 years for leases is a reasonable length of time. People would be able to leave leases before this period ends, much in the same way as that already happens with private leases, usually incurring a cost of about 2 months rent or so. Leases would be extendable after this period at government discretion, of course, and after a lease ended, a government would compensate the leaseholder for any improvements made to the land, providing an incentive to build, renovate, and innovate. We also tell you the government would provide land to less wealthy people at a price below market value, but would also use tools, maybe like auctions, to track demand and anticipate trends in the market, right? So onto my substantive, the reduction of inequality and poverty. Note, the driving factor behind skyrocketing global inequality and all of the horrendous harms that come with that is not gaps in wages or in salaries. It's enormously disproportionate amounts of capital held by elites. Most commonly, this takes the form of land and property because it's all but guaranteed to increase in value over time. I wouldn't be able to list all of the harms of this if I dedicated my whole speech to it, but here's 5 impacts that we have anyway. 1, poor people, no thank you, are locked out of land ownership by high prices because private owners will always want to sell for profit. They will always drive up prices. 2, things like loans often require land as collateral, locking the poor out of the opportunities that getting loans could provide. 3, land is passed down generationally, entrenching class systems and meaning land will never be distributed to those who most need it or would use it most effectively. 4, it forces the poor to pay rent to the rich, thus massively increasing the gap in people's wealth with no discernible impacts on the economy. And 5thly, it allows landowners to use their land in a manner that creates negative externalities like gentrification, pollution, and other things, right? And so on and so on. We tell you the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, more marginalized, and living worse lives. Why doesn't our world have these problems? No, thank you. Because we tell you that, like, quite simply, the wealthy don't own this land, and therefore are not able to exploit these kinds of benefits. It's the state owning it, right? Importantly, we give you differences between wealthy landowners and the state and the ways in which they approach landowning. Because what is a landowner's only incentive? It's profit. It's making money out of their land, right? That means that the kinds of behavior they exhibit is making their land really, really expensive, either to buy or to rent, potentially being negligent, not caring about wider harms of their land usage, because all they have to care is their own profit, not societal impact. And they're very often exploitative because they have so much control over people and they're able to leverage that in their own profit interest. The government, on the other hand, has the incentive of just winning votes and being popular with people, right? The subsequent behavior is things like wanting to reduce homelessness and poverty by providing housing to loads of people, like allowing citizens to save on rent to contribute to the economy more because they want to be the party that benefits the economy. It's just like being nicer to leaseholders but on like a wider scale because they don't want to annoy their voters, right? It's like ensuring use of land doesn't carry external harms for wider society, because as opposed to private landowners, the government has to care and does have a vested interest in wider society. Note that giving out housing and doing all of these things is now, under our side of the house, just so much easier for governments to do because they don't have to contend with all the barriers of private ownership. But what else can the government use this tool for? We think they could do things like solving spatial inequality by ensuring that large parts of the workforce aren't forced to live ridiculous distances away from city centres where they work and have to spend loads of money on commuting the whole time. A government can enable people to stop wasting money on paying massive rents to the rich and start investing in the world around them, right? They spend more money in shops. They spend more money like lending money potentially to friends to start businesses, right? Proposition is the side of economic stimulation because we give people more capital to invest and to use and to contribute to an economy. The government can also do things like ensuring gentrification doesn't price poorer people out of their homes, because that would be a really unpopular thing for the government to let happen, right? They would ensure that the leases are structured in a way that prevents that. They could provide a safety net, right? Allowing people to take more risks. You can start a business under our side of the house because you know that no matter how it goes, you're not going to lose your house. You do more risk-taking behavior, you're more able to lift yourself out of poverty, you're more able to contribute to society. The government can also make sure that the scarce commodity of land is used to its greatest potential, rather than being bought up and left empty by Russian oligarchs hoping for a profit, as happens to such disastrous effect in London. We tell you we give you less inequality because of this, more opportunities for the poor, no homelessness because the government just has that incentive to end it and now has the means to do it really easily, and just effectively use land, right? Opposition needs to justify private ownership that led to all of these problems in the first place and is constantly worsening them over time. Before my second substantive, a POI.
Given that elections today are increasingly decided by the sizes of donations by rich people, why don't you believe that governments will rather cater to their incentives?
Okay, because we think that the government has like a lot of things that they want to appeal to a wider voter base, right? They are not going to put in place policies that massively alienate vast numbers of people, because that's just something that's going to get voted them out, because that's such a negative government presence in that person's life, right? We just don't think the private companies have the same incentives and have the same like monopoly under our side of the house for reasons that we'll bring you, right? But second point of substantive, it is easier to enact large-scale infrastructure projects under our side. Under the status quo, cities, by virtue of private ownerships, are designed terribly, right? They emerge on this ad hoc basis to the extent that states are even able to do city planning whatsoever. They have to contend with people leveraging private property against them, limiting the scope and increasing the cost of any infrastructure work they want to do. This looks like people refusing to let property be used for low-cost housing or subway stations because it might inconvenience that individual at the cost of like the greater good, right? Under the motion, we just tell you the government controls leases so they can far more quickly wait for a lease to end and then use that land for something productive. We also tell you people are just more incentivized to leave their land if asked, because they are guaranteed cheaper rent somewhere else. It's also way cheaper when governments want to do this, so they can be far more ambitious in their infrastructure projects. I think this just looks like way more efficient and like people-friendly cities, right? Under the status quo, you get Jakarta, where people spend 200 hours a year sitting in traffic, right? We allow for the most efficient transport system to be designed, saving money and saving emissions. Infrastructure itself brings immense benefits, right? Our world looks like one where you can institute high-speed rail across the United States, which you can't do at the moment, to massive economic damage because some guy owns half of Utah and will never allow a railroad to go through it, right? We tell you this has so many benefits under our side of the house. We can do things like renewable energy because we allow governments to make good practice part of their leases. We disincentivize individuals from abusing the environment around them because then their lease won't get renewed from a government that resents that. We just tell you that if you want to side with the team that logically extends existing state power, letting us eradicate homelessness, tackle global inequality, help the environment and invigorate economies, and so many other things, side with Team Scotland.
Okay, I would like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech to kick us off. And now look across the table and call upon the first speaker from Team Czech Republic to open the case for the opposition. Here.
When proposition tells us that private property is like inherently an oppressive thing, and that's something that the state should be a lot better at controlling, we want to ask them, why then shouldn't the state control like literally everything? And the answer is because the state in general tends to be ineffective. We have run this experiment countless times and we have seen economies crash. And we believe that a similar road is one to which side proposition will be headed. Three things. First, our stance. Second, rebuttal. third, our own argument. We bring you 3 points under our stance. The first thing is that we want to take into combination beneficial market forces and smart regulations to mitigate any potential externalities. Secondly, how do these regulations look? We're talking about projects such as the state building social housing to accommodate homeless people, right? We're talking about eliminating building permit restrictions, which, for example, in San Francisco, create 50% of the prices of the houses. Literally, the government not allowing private developers to build there, right? This is important because not only it can then decrease the prices of housing and make it more affordable for your average person, but it also shows that the government involvement is what makes it counterproductive. But we also would want to, for example, implement a land tax, no thank you, which can incentivize people to not let land lay idle because they would have to use it for some project for that land to make active revenue. And we think that because of that, we are solving most of the problems, right? But thirdly, and this is very important, because in the status quo, for example, in Germany, we have partial land ownership where the state can own 25% of land. And we believe that insofar as proposition talks to us about huge infrastructure projects or other types of policies, why can't this be solved by this marginal land ownership? Why does the state have to own everything? And moving on to my rebuttal, right? Let's move on to their first argument. We have two main reactions. The first thing is that their whole argumentation is contingent on the state being able to properly redistribute land. And we give you 3 reasons as to why that is not the case. Firstly, because there is a plethora of factors such as lobbying, corruption, and nepotism. And note that since this is a This House Prefers motion, side proposition has a structurally higher incentive for major corporations or rich individuals to actively lobby the government because they can get so much more out of doing that, right? And we say that this is very important when they talk about proper redistribution. But secondly, we talk to you about the oppression of minorities, right? We say that, for example, in India, if you were to enact this policy, Muslims would be oppressed even more, right? But talk about your average black person in the United States, where already they are not getting credit, even if they have the same credit rating. We think that this would only increase the oppression. But thirdly, we say that the government cannot properly simulate the market mechanism, and because of that, before the government actually decides to whom it should lend the land, it will most probably take too long, and the land will lay idle, right? But now let's move. No, thank you. But now let's move to their second argument, because what we say here is that we can already build large projects, right? We have something that is called the buy privilege in Germany, where the state can buy land and be the first in line, right? We say that already the state owns land, but also that we have other policies in extreme cases, such as eminent domain. We think that this is on average much better because it is targeted, because it doesn't stifle the economic growth inside the entire country, right? And when they talk about the state building massive projects, the first thing that comes to mind are the bridges to nowhere in Hong Kong or the ghost towns in China. And because of that, we don't think that the state is the best actor. Now, moving on to my own argument about why proposition replaces beneficial market forces. We bring you 2 mechanisms. Firstly, they eliminate flexibility. Because insofar as I can freely buy land and use it for my own economic good in the status quo, I also have the ability to then sell it, right? And because of that, the person that buys it can also gain more benefits from the land because that person might have more capital to then properly utilize this specific piece of land. Before I continue, go.
If you think that the state is such a bad actor, then why are you conceding that it's more beneficial that it organises social housing rather than leaving it totally to the market?
Because we think that you have a certain limit, right? We think that the free market is something that generally is effective, but produces some externalities. We think that we mitigate these externalities with the status quo, and that taking the state power even further creates diminishing returns. All right, so this flexibility is important because when you take this transaction of someone selling land because they have other incentives and someone buying it because they have more capital, both parties end up being happy, and the land ends up being used for more productive means. But the second mechanism here concerns price. Because on the land market, you have a plethora of different buyers and sellers, and each of them creates their own analysis as to what they can do with the land, what project they can build, right? How they can use it for agriculture. And this is important because you create this amalgamation or accumulation of brain power, which is then reflected in the price. And that is why price is something unique. Price is a way to give valuable information and to properly allocate resources in terms of their economic productivity, right? And this is something that proposition fundamentally takes away. Why is this important? Because on the comparative, they want to make a government committee. No, thank you. That like literally does 4 different things, right? Like makes it flexible, extends it, gives land to the less wealthy, but also like auctions it to the more wealthy, which like we think is a contradiction. The government is not able to make such nuanced decisions because you have millions of different agents interacting on this market, creating this information. This leads to 3 distinct impacts. Firstly, we can have higher output comparatively under our side, because when you have effective investment and when you're able to have flexibility in terms of like shifting your investment when the conditions change, you are more likely to create efficient output. And this is crucial because over the long run, no, thank you, this output can then accumulate and create more economic growth. And note like that over the long run, economic growth is something that has lifted people out of poverty everywhere in the West, right? But secondly, we tell you that it enables people to reach their potential more fully. Because insofar as a company can like properly buy a specific place for its factory for the highest price, that company probably has the most innovative potential. The company probably can utilize that land to make the most effective output, and it can utilize the skills of the locals as well. No, thank you. This is something in which like the free choices of the company interplay with the free choices of the locals, and something that the state cannot ever properly coordinate on a national scale. This gives people the ability to be like fully employed, to fully utilize their skills, which gives them personal benefits, but it also makes their output more effective, which can then spread to the rest of the society and benefit other members of it, right? But thirdly, and possibly most importantly, when you have more interactions on the market and when you have more money circulating the market because you have more efficient output, the government is able to collect more tax revenue. And this is the comparative, right? Because proposition overburdens the government. Because under our side, the government doesn't have to make like thousands of calculations in terms of land allocation, but it can target its policies and make them focus on places that specifically matter. Because it can better address homelessness, because it can better provide social housing where it is needed the most. And not only that, but it has more resources because it generates comparatively more tax revenue. So because we have like more means to alleviate people out of poverty, because the government has more resources, and because it can target its help much more efficiently, you should vote side opposition.
Okay, I would like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech, and I would like to look back across the table and call upon the second speaker for Team Scotland to continue the proposition case. Here.
The greatest deception in history was the elite convincing the world that land could be owned. Scotland says that we are lost if we forget that the fruits of the world belong to all and the earth belongs to no one. One case today about how specifically we get far better complex economic forces under Team Scotland. But first, some rebuttal and reframing. So what did they, Lachlan gave you a case which was about how we get far better levels of equality in society, permeating through all levels of society under our motion. How did they respond to this? They told us instead, in response to Lachlan's infrastructure point, that there were bridges to nowhere. Yet this is where Team Czechia makes a fundamental strategic mistake. They misidentify the exact kind of government forward planning that Lachlan tells you is such a positive force for society, that eventually these will be bridges to somewhere, that eventually these ghost towns will be filled up with happy and fulfilled residents who are living better quality lives than these slums that opposition supports. This is when they concede this point, right? Note that they did not touch at all Lachlan's key analysis about how land should be like health, being administered for the public good, and how land is a vehicle for generational wealth, which massively harms the equality of society on the whole, right? Next, how is this different from the government controlling everything, right? The distinction here is that in like more authoritarian states where the land owned goods where the state owns land, goods, and services and takes all profit from that, right? We think that individuals still might get to maintain profit from their enterprise. The profit incentive incentivizes innovation. We get both benefits. We think Team Czech succeeds here. Right, if someone owns like a farm under government land under our system, they still get to keep all of the profits from this. Like under what they mischaracterize our system as, they would have an incentive to underreport earnings. Whereas under our side, you're still responsible for yields. There is no incentive to like commit any of the actions which they suppose you do, and then you still have every reason to run your effective as efficiently and effectively as possible. We just create equal opportunity to run farms, right? Let's talk about the alternatives that they gave. We just don't buy this, right? Land tax is simply not good enough to stop people from owning multiple properties given the asset price appreciation, right? And by suggesting 25% land ownership by government, they concede that the state is a far better landlord when it comes to 90% of people than private enterprise. Yet they give no other reasons as to why we should limit the access of government to owning land other than the free market is good in a response to Owen's excellent POI, or give specific reasons in my speech as to why this just isn't true, right? On political pressure, no thank you. Firstly, we tell you the landlord lobby disappears at the point you no longer have access to privately rent out land and exploit people who are forced to turn to you. Secondly, we tell you that decreasing the wealth of the rich through removing their land reduces their political power and their ability to malignly influence democracy. Thirdly, we tell you it mitigates the extent to which the rich can actually benefit from this, at the point at which they are no longer able to steal land through manipulating democracy from other people, right? And fourthly, let's just step back. What are they actually saying here? They're telling us that the government can sometimes represent corporate interests. Sure, we largely buy this on both sides of the house to an extent, but the alternative they have to recommend is a status quo where have already succeeded, at least mutually exclusive, right? And finally, about minorities, right? Firstly, we tell you they can't do anything. Why can't they do any of this under the status quo, right? If governments are such malign actors, they likely have the act to bar ethnic groups from accessing any housing than they do, like under our motion, they likely already persecute these minorities in a far more insidious way under the status quo in Op's best case. Secondly, we think that governments are largely representative of the peoples that elect them, like landlords who have disproportionate social and political influence under the status quo. Or has to tell us why these landlords who elect these massively harmful governments in their best case are somehow immune from these very same prejudices that they criticize so much, right? We think that they are far more independent actors as landlords and are far more capable of persecuting these minorities, especially since they don't have the mechanisms like international pressure on them. Thirdly, let's bring the comparative. We think that most governments under either side of the house are good actors. We think that in the vast majority of cases, housing gets far better for minorities. Access to this stops when landlords are no longer able to discriminate against them. And fourthly, in a world where the government is tyrannical, we tell you that you get some form of accountability by voting them out in the ballot box and exercising democratic freedoms in order to change this kind of policy. We have no mechanism of accountability for the evil landlords doing the exact same actions under Op's world. We tell you this just simply results in a housing structure that works better for minorities in a world where less oppression exists. Finally, these people, in the Op's best case, where these governments systematically deny housing rights, freedom rights to minorities, we tell you they're now far more easy to access stuff like housing in other countries when they become refugees, if they leave the country, if they're so persecuted. We tell you this just isn't true under the status quo when you have massive refugee camps. We think we just make life better for them on the whole. And finally, we get onto Op's single case about beneficial market forces. My case will directly clash with this, but a few responses. Firstly, about not improving land, we tell you government will still pay at the end for improvements, so you still have an incentive to do so. Secondly, why would government not renew your lease if you have a thriving business on your land that's improving your community? We think this comes downstream from investment. And if you want to keep your lease, you're probably incentivized to invest more into this. Business. Thirdly, actors under the status quo can just buy property as an investment and do nothing with it. Russian oligarchs own significant amounts of housing in London that goes empty. This surely isn't consistent with Op's principles. We tell you the status quo just doesn't have the kind of efficiency that Op relies on you believing. Right. So we also told you why central planning, rather than scattered, isolated individuals trying to advance their own agenda at the cost of anyone else, is so much better. We got no response to this from Op. We still get better economic growth. I'll take you now.
Okay, you're saying that at the one hand, through populist vote, you can outvote like people like landlords, etc. On the other hand, you're saying that the government will like house refugees who the populist vote is generally against. You have a major tension here.
So basically, when we remove, landlords have no mechanism of accountability to them under the status quo. Governments can. But in the worst cases where we can't get accountability and like persecution continues, other countries are now more able to house these refugees at the point at which they can better construct housing. I think this is dealt with. So my point is going to be about better global economics. The first part of this is that financial crashes become far more likely. The conclusion of this argument is that mortgages make the world economy far more unstable and lead to financial crashes which cause mass suffering. Okay. Firstly, why do people take out debt? Lackland explains systemic reasons as to why people are forced to take debt to buy land as an asset and as a necessity for survival. The result of this is massive mortgage rates. So why is this so terrible? Because it's a massive part of global debt. Look at 2007 when the mortgage securities market was worth almost as much as global GDP, which has massive harms when it inevitably collapses. We think it's an intuitive principle not to put your eggs in one basket. Secondly, mortgages are so profitable for banks that they necessarily get risky with them. They become complex financial instruments traded in compound, like the trade in compound CDSs in 2008. Regulation is not enough as the profit is so great that they'll always find a way. Because so many people have mortgages and they're such a major part of debt, these inevitably cause financial crashes when they collapse. We think people can only pay them back when interest rates are low, and this isn't possible 100% of the time, or we fear the rest of the economy collapsing. We tell you private ownership, land ownership is incontrovertibly linked to the cycle of recessions. Opposition necessarily have to defend the legacy of 2008. This is the result that their model produces. We tell you this can't happen if the government owns all land. We get all of the benefits of mortgages, but none of the harms of instability. We also think we weather these events better at the point at which we're able to rehome people much easier after a financial crash, like subsidize and suspend rent on the parts of the government. And we think when less people are in debt to banks, the economy as a whole can better withstand these crashes. Proposition.
Okay, I would like to thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I'd like to look back across the table to welcome the second speaker for Team Czech Republic to continue the case for the opposition. Here.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see me?
Oh,
awesome. Honorable panel, coming from a post-communist country where state failed its role as arbiter of the whole economy, I've never been more proud to defend the free market forces combined with smart regulation. We tell you that on principle, we believe that those who are best fit to manage land should own it. We have never been more proud to oppose. In my speech, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, show you why proposition fails 3 of its burdens, and then bring a constructive. Towards the first burden then, where we believe that proposition failed to show why our system of the status quo is worth changing. Because they first contend that there are bad incentives with the landlords, but they're not being comparative here. We tell you that if they bring you the incentive structure that they want to build, that they want to rent a lot and extract a lot of money, we believe that by extension they probably have an incentive to build a lot of houses so they can then extract a lot of this rent. We believe that competition is the core principle here because it creates the race to the bottom and depresses the prices. Proposition never reacted to this point. Second, why is our system good? Because it creates good allocative decisions. And we believe that the lack of sophistication in the reaction brought by the second speaker of proposition
point of information
and loses them the debate. No, thank you. Because when we tell them through a nuanced analysis that we need the price, that we need to know the price, that it is a crucial indicator of commitment and confidence in the innovation of one's project, they just say, oh, government can do that as well, and eventually these bridges will lead to somewhere. That is not comparative. We tell you that there are structural reasons for why government is very likely to make bad allocative decisions and in the end cost a lot of money to the whole economy because a lot of this economy depends on the right allocation on land. The nuance here is that whereas on side of proposition you you have millions of individual minds deciding what the right price is and what the good project is, on a proposition you only get like this random committee of officials who have never seen the plot of land that they're supposed to assign and decide on, and
point of information
does not depend on the success of this project. And lastly here, they tell us that, oh, but there will be a tragedy of commons in the status quo. We tell you no, on the opposite. If proposition tells us that the government would buy out the projects that were built on the land, we believe that that necessarily creates an incentive for me as an owner to abuse the land, because I know that the government will then buy it out from me. Therefore, there's more tragedy of commons on their side of the house. Crucially then, the comparative here is that we can get and generate more money. We can generate more money for the individual, which means that overall we get less homeless people than proposition would.
Point of information.
Also, if they don't think you want to talk about externalities of the market, we tell you that we can cover for them because everyone is richer. On the state level here, we tell you that state can have more taxes, so it can focus on doing the things it does best, but that it can also, again, solve these externalities. We never hear a reaction why that is bad. Essentially here, we ask proposition and challenge them to tell us, if state is so good, why not let it run the entire economy? We tell you we have tried it and it has failed every single time. We want to hear why land is unique. We have not heard it thus far. Second reason that proposition fails is why status quo is beyond repair by current policies that we already see in status quo. And they hung their case on 3 premises that they will solve. Firstly, that they will make land more available to the government. Here we bring a nuanced analysis how we already have measures like eminent domain, privilege of first buy, and that already the state owns vast amounts of this land. We never hear a reaction. They drop it in their second speech. Go ahead. I'll take the POI. Okay,
the private sector is so keen to solve society's ills. Why does it build so many expensive houses empty rather than social housing under the status quo?
Okay, thank you. I was just getting to it because that is the second point. They hung their case on the premise that they will build more social housing. We tell you that the reason why we cannot build social housing or we cannot build any houses in San Francisco is because there is suffocating regulation, which creates shadow tax, which accounts for 50% of the property price in the city. We tell you that the problem is too much reaction, not too little. And secondly, here we tell you that if the state is so good and it has an incentive to cater to all these voters, then why is it not building social housing in the status quo? We demand a reaction. And lastly here, they still keep coming back with this premise that, you know, the land is lying idle because of speculators and Russian oligarchs. We tell you that we have land tax. We can tax it out heavily and make it very, very unprofitable. Essentially, what we tell you here is that the clash is whether government should be a market participant or market regulator. And that is the difference. We tell you that it should only regulate because it is faster, it is less uncertain, and ultimately it is more precise. Last burden that they fail is to show us why should state take literally 100% of the economy, why that is exclusively the right decision. We tell you that it is not the right decision because you, first of all, create incentive to lobby. Because now investors have an incentive to account for all this uncertainty that is created because proposition has still not specified specific criterion on which they would hand out this land. They say, oh, it would be some randomly elected governments, or oh, it would be for social good, or oh, it would be for the market. We still don't know. And this uncertainty creates incentive in investors to lobby the government and make it less effective. But also it shows you that this lack of bringing out specific conditions that the government would set, that they hung their case on the premise that they believe like these all populist government would just solve it. And we tell you that this has an immense motivation to harm the most vulnerable minorities. Because if you elect populistic governments of xenophobes, they will not build they will not build refugee camps. They will instead not extend the lease to a black person in Alabama. Overall, we tell you that governments are bad. We need to support private ownership. And the reason, and the additional reason that I'm going to show to you here is because of private ownership and how it is crucial for development. This is my split extension. extension, because we tell you that certainty is unique to ownership and gives me unique motivation, because I know that I will reap the fruit of my labor. Essentially, because proposition increases the risk, because I do not know whether the populist government will extend my lease, I am very likely to feel this uncertainty. I am likely to be impacted by it, because when investing, I'm asked to make huge commitments, like, buying the land, like taking a loan, like building the factory. We tell you that what this will do is that it will essentially dissuade many investors from investing in the first place. It will be the most responsible investors. Therefore, the opportunity cost on proposition is that even if we assume that their governments are cool at choosing who the right investor should be, they do not have a good pool of deciding or pool from which they can pull these investors. But even those who would invest have an incentive to abuse it and have short-term incentives. In agriculture, they have an incentive to overexploit the soil and plant cash crops instead of cover crops, because they do not know if they will get a lease extension. They will take less care for the environment. They will not build long-term projects which return only after long-term, because they do not know if it will pay off. But this also happens in construction, because in China, where the similar model like proposition proposes already exists, the incentive creates the incentive to build houses which are of low quality and which no one repairs. Overall, we tell you that the only way to unlock our productive capacity is through free market and is through smart regulation, which is why you oppose.
Okay, I would like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. And now I'd like to look back across the table and call upon the third speaker for Team Scotland to continue the proposition case. Here.
The opposition concede much of our case when they say, when they say that the government is best placed to do social housing. Then they contradict themselves when they say that actually the private sector is better suited to solve homelessness. They then say that government regulations have caused homelessness in California, and then they say in the next sentence that the government is best placed to act as a regulator of markets, right? It's because opposition have never settled on a clear line what they actually want. It's too late for them to clean up their case. They're already lost this debate. Some things to get out of the way before I get on to the bulk of my case. Right? They're asking us why we think that land is like this thing rather than like the entirety of the market. Okay, there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, we think that like land is an essential thing which anyone needs in order to like have a home and in order to produce anything. We think that therefore is a basic need which the government should provide, as it should provide other basic needs, like healthcare and like a minimum amount of income. And secondly, we think that like you cannot create land. People who own land do not have it because they deserve it and therefore they've contributed to the world, right? Rather they just ultimately it was taken by violence and it's just been paid for down the line.
UI.
2 points. No, thank you. So in this speech, I'm going to talk about firstly what the incentives of governments are and why we think they're better than private landlords, and secondly, on which side gets more efficient use of land overall. Before this, 2 points which have come out of our case, which they've yet to actually respond to. One on the issue of inequality, right? Auckland, in our first speech, pointed out the stark inequality that exists and how landlords are able to leverage their power to extract more and more money from the poor, and how this is a totally intolerable situation which we cannot abide by. Opposition have never shown how their market forces that they love are actually ever going to be able to correct this process of consolidation of power. Okay. Also, right in our second speech, Oscar made our point about the prevalence of market failures when it comes to financial crises and how these are so dependent on the land market. We think that the financial crashes exert huge damage on the global population. We think they've never shown any way that they can ameliorate this on their side. We think for these two reasons alone, they fail to engage adequately with their case. We've already won because we have these two massive impacts, which they've never got to grips with. Then onto the stuff that they do contest. Let's look at the incentives of governments. So we told you from the very start that governments are better actors than landlords. One, they're democratic and thus must help the people or are voted out. Secondly, they're responsible for the country as a whole. And so they cannot have externalities because, for example, if they impoverish the population, then that comes back to bite them in the form of low tax revenue, right? They destroy the environment, then they're less able to do production in the future. And these are whereas landlords have these. externalities. So what do they say? So one, they tell us that governments are beholden to private interests. You do this in a POI in the very first speech. Now, this just doesn't work as a response if you think about it, because private landlords, which they defend on their side, are private interests, right? So at least we think that the government has some democratic accountability, which is far better than private landlords who have absolutely none. We think that ultimately, in order for no matter how much money private landlords throw, no matter how much money corporations throw at them, governments need votes to win. That's something that you can't get on their side. But furthermore, our motion reduces the power that private interests have over the government, because the main way, which we've told you, in which the global rich consolidate their power, is by having land and being able to make money whilst idly doing nothing, because people have to pay for that, right? We think that when we reduce this, we reduce the wealth of the capitalist class, and therefore we improve this on our side. This private interest point doesn't hold up. Secondly, they say the government is ineffective. Now, this is really what I'm going to deal with in my second point, right? I know that their analysis here was quite thin on the ground and just saying there are lots of things that a government would have to do. We think that we've given reasons why governments are big actors, which are able to look at things in a cohesive way, which private individuals don't. Thirdly, on this idea that the government can be racist, right? Two ideas in response. One, we think that generally governments are less racist than private landlords, right? Because if you look at the US, to take an example, the government has explicitly outlawed racial discrimination for years, but landlords are still able to get away with it because they're not accountable in the same way, right? Because they know that wealthy white people are more likely to buy a house in their area if they don't have to be associated with poor or ethnic minority people. And this is something which governments can't do because it will be electoral suicide. Secondly, we think if a government is really this tyrannical, then it doesn't matter who owns the land because they can just send in the tanks and do whatever they want anyway, right? So the worst governments don't care. This motion doesn't really affect them because they're going to be colluding with private interests in any case, right? And they have the power to simply override landlords. As Oscar tells you, in these very worst cases, no thank you, at least we can give them better support for refugees if they happen to come to our country. Then on to this idea of who gets more efficient land use. So firstly, on their argument that private ownership incentivizes good use of land, which state ownership doesn't do. So the idea here, firstly, is that we disincentivize efficient land use because people aren't able to profit off any investments that they make. Now, clearly here, they're not listening to our case because we've never said that we're going to seize all of the crops that a farmer produces or whatever, right? We simply say that they have to give the land back after a certain number of years, right? When they talk about the failures of the Soviet Union, this doesn't apply because people who produce more are still going to get more. Then on this idea of improvements, we have said explicitly in our case that we compensate for improvements that you get for improvements that you make to the land on our site at the end of your lease. And we probably renew the lease in any case. We think that they haven't dealt with this, right? They're not dealing with the reality of our lease. Secondly, we think that this is actually a huge problem under the existing patterns of land ownership, because rather than the earth being patched with nice family farms, right, land ownership is consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. And we've told you, most farmers are peasants and the servants of landlords, and therefore they have no reason to work harder, because in any case, their landlords are going to take a lion's share of the profits and hand out to them wages that leave them nearly starving. We don't think they've addressed this in their case. Well, thank you. Thirdly, under the status quo, if you own a patch of land, you can simply wait. Its value will appreciate in a few years because there will be an increasing demand, but a fixed supply, right? Because there's no more land, but there are more people. Thus, you profit by doing absolutely nothing to benefit anyone in society, right? This is why, as we've repeatedly told you, and they've never engaged with, you have flats lying empty in London, in New York, and everywhere because they can be traded as an asset without contributing to human. We think under our side, if you do nothing with land, under 10 years' time, when the lease comes in, right, you haven't made any profit because you don't get to own it and sell it and that sort of thing, right? So for this reason, we get increased incentives to make improvements because you need to in order to make any profit from your land. So we've clearly shown that there's an increased incentive to use land well on our side. But secondly, on this idea of efficient land use, we told you that we get more socially beneficial land use on our side because when landlords do decide to that it's worth it to do something with their land, their incentive, as we told you from the very start, is simply to extract as much profit as quickly as they can, and this is something they didn't deal with, right? This looks like chopping down the Amazon to put cattle there with no regard for indigenous people or environmental consequences of it, right? Because they'll be long gone by the time any of these things take their toll. This changes because the state doesn't have, because of the reasons that we told you in our very first point, right? The state doesn't have these externalities because all of these negative consequences will falter back in terms of low tax base and low votes for them, right? So this means that the state is able to do its effective policies, it's able to put a wind farm somewhere where it would be useful because you don't have the private landowner say, I don't want this, blotting out my lovely land that I like to enjoy, like strolling about, right? We think that you can still build railways in order to decrease traffic because you don't have landlords objecting to this. And these are things which they never showed, and as long as private landlords exist, they will be able to lobby the state using their immense amount of power to stop these things from happening. And they will always be able to resist any sorts of regulations until the state is actually able to expropriate land and do it directly, right? In order to reduce inequality, stop financial crises, and get more efficient land use, will crop.
Okay, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. And now, back across the table and call upon the third speaker for Team Czech Republic to continue the case for the opposition. Here.
Only the lack of reactions coming from side of proposition should lose them today's debate. When we come and say and explain to you how effective allocation of resources we can have thanks to private ownership that we have, and they literally give us no reaction whatsoever, just a side of that private ownership is not for everybody, we believe that this is enough for you because we have still a lot of constructive staying in today's debate. What I'm going to do in my speech are two things. First, I'm going to talk about our unique mechanism that cannot be achieved under the side of proposition. And secondly, I will compare you the two worlds under the criteria of which side is more likely to achieve development. I will go around investment and also the economic development as a whole. But before that, let's take a look at the strategic mistakes made by side of proposition. Here, aside of the lack of reactions I've already mentioned, they failed to fulfill their burdens of proof that they had in today's debate. Twofold. First, we asked them throughout their speeches why exclusively land is the one that needs to be governed by the state. We ask them when we take them at their highest ground at state, say that the state is the best actor and the most effective one to lead the economy. Why don't we have the planet economy? They have never really engaged with this question. We think enough of reason for you to vote us. But secondly, we also ask them why it is necessary for the state to own entire land. And we gave you three mechanisms of how the state is currently operating with the land and how this is enough. They have never really responded to anything of this, just like saying that we need something more, but never really explained the necessity and why the status quo is not enough with the regulations that we want to impose. So the first question here, what are the unique mechanisms that we have under our side of the house? Two major. First, we have targeted policies. So what we're talking about, it essentially means that when the side of proposition wants to own the whole land, basically control all the economy, we believe that it is not necessary, and that if there are some negative externalities produced by market, we are able to regulate this by the targeted policies, by the targeted regulations, such as the land tax, or such as just deregulating the building permits, as we have seen in San Francisco. They have never really engaged with these examples, and our only way of arguing was this example of coming from London. We believe that with regulations we could even repair it in London. They have never proved us the necessity for why we need this worldwide. But second uniqueness here is that we have proven to you that under our side of the house, we are much more likely to achieve rational decisions based on reliable price information. They have never reacted upon this price mechanism that is created by this private ownership, by the transactions that are in the economy that are happening every day, because they are stopping those interactions for transactions from happening. They're also actively stopping and destroying this price mechanism whatsoever. So we believe that because of these two unique things we have under our side of the house, we are much more better in managing the economy and in managing the development as a whole. So now moving on to the final question of today's debate on which side is more likely to achieve the development. So first point here, I'm going to compare you the incentives for short-term or long-term investments. This is something that we included in our split argument in our second speech. They have never reacted on, so I'm going to quickly repeat and highlight what was the most important for you. So what we told you essentially is that this factor of certainty is something that we should never ever get rid of, because this is something according to which the investors make their decisions, because they have to take into consideration the risks, and and then therefore afterwards make the decision. For example, we can picture this on the example from Ethiopia. When in Ethiopia the private ownership was introduced, the productivity raised by 40%. We believe that the private ownership itself creates the certainty that we need for sustainable development, for long-term investments that we want to have in our economy and on the market. So what are the areas we have discussed? First area, agriculture. We believe this is crucial because when you overexploit the land under the side of proposition, as you actively create those short-term incentives because you know that your lease will run out and you won't invest in the long run, we believe that the agriculture will suffer from long run. And therefore, if they want to cater to the most vulnerable groups of society, being the poor individuals, these are the most likely to suffer from not having enough food coming from agriculture. But secondly, we were talking about environment as a whole, as those investors are much more likely to create pollutions because they don't really care about the land, because they can be, the only thing that can be certain about is the fact that the land will come back to state. Therefore, because they lose this incentive coming from ownership to care about the land for themselves, also for their, for example, future investments or future generations, we believe that the loss of this incentive is something what loses the side of proposition today's debate. But finally, we were talking about the sustainable housing. Again, lack of reaction by side of proposition. We brought you the example of China and Hong Kong in a second, where we explain to you how they're rather creating incentives for building ghost towns or bridges that are leading essentially to nowhere. Therefore, again, inefficient allocation of resources. Before I move on, yes.
Why do I no longer have an incentive to effectively and efficiently make profit from my business at the point at which the land I am leasing is not mine?
Look, you still have the profit incentive. The point is that it is limited for the time of your lease. So if you have lease for 10 years, you don't have incentive to invest, for example, into irrigation channels when you know that this money invested into those channels would come back, let's say, in 20 years. Therefore, you rather choose more short-term investment, or you choose more exploitative way of gaining profit. So now let's take a look at the housing back. So first, the examples from China and Hong Kong, no reaction. But we also told you here that we can provide social housing for the people that needs it. And we believe that we can be very effective in this, even if when you take into consideration the fact that we're more likely to achieve this economic development and also collect more taxes on the revenue. So we have more resources for helping those people that are in need of it. But also we were talking about minorities here. And then here we essentially told you that the government don't have like that much of incentive to care about minorities as such under their side of the house, because they want to cater to their voters base. And also finally, when they were talking about like this mortgage things, we think that the problem is that they will not be the incentives to build the high quality houses in the first place. So they're really undermining the thing about social housing for the poor individuals. But finally, let's take a look at the economic development from twofold. We told you that the allocation of resources is likely to be ineffective. Firstly, when you have the non-functional government, here they never explain to us how they're going to manage this in developing countries. But secondly, we told you that there are structural incentives for lobbying and corruption, because those investors want to gain a certainty, at least up to a certain point, so that they know that they can do the investment. So these governments are likely to be corrupt, and therefore the investments or this whole system is likely to fall down. But finally, we are talking about the populists, because here again, lack of engagement by side of proposition, when we explain to you that those will rather cater to the majority and ignore the minorities, not solving any oppression that is happening in the status quo. Even if the side of proposition would have functional government, they still have the worst decision because of the ineffective allocation of resources under their side of the house. For all those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Okay, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. And now I'd like to call upon the third speaker, the reply speech for the Czech Republic to close out the opposition case.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. We believe that, like, through observation, everyone can see that states have completely failed to properly handle the coronavirus. And because of that, we shouldn't give the majority of the economy to them as well. I'll be doing three things. First, I'll take a look at strategic mistakes. Secondly, I'll ask where is there better allocation? And thirdly, I'll be talking about individual decisions. Two main strategic mistakes that we identify under side proposition. The first one concerns that they failed to engage in the counterfactual, right? Because we asked them, why is land tax not enough? And then they only responded by saying, oh, but like the price of the land rises faster. And when Victor says, well, then we increase the land tax, they have no response and just keep on repeating these claims in the third, right? But what we also said is that, like, why isn't social housing enough, right? Why isn't the fact that we eliminate building permits and literally decrease the prices of houses by 50% not enough? They haven't properly engaged with this. And this is important because on the comparative, Victor tells you that when you cannot extract profit as a private owner, you don't have the incentives to build houses under their side, and that is why their policies are significantly less effective. But secondly, they couldn't properly respond to our stance, because when we told them, hey guys, your problems can already be solved when the state can own just some land. Why does it have to own literally everything? We don't hear a coherent response, right? But when we ask them, okay, if the state is so great, why can't it own everything? They tell us, oh, well, the state is there to innovate, or like the private sector is there to innovate, you know. Exactly. That's why we want people to innovate on land as well. That's why we want like developers to build more land. That's why we want people to freely exchange it to use it in the most effective way possible. On the other hand, we were consistent. We consistently told you that we want a combination of a free market and smart regulations. We told you that we want to emulate a model in Germany. They have tried to challenge us, but they failed on this point. Now, where is there better allocation of resources? Because this is very important. Their entire case is hinged on the state actually properly redistributing it, right? So the first thing we tell you is that there will be some sort of a populist vote that that proposition admits themselves, right? And this is important because then at the same time they say, oh, we will help Black people and oh, we will help refugees, right? Their best case scenario, even if this populist vote wouldn't succumb to lobbying, is a tyranny of the majority. And we would much rather have those minorities like empower themselves through economic growth, right? The second thing that we told you here was that you have more lobbying and corruption. And this is important because they included developing countries in their model where this has even like worse implications and even worse redistribution. But when lastly we told you about minorities, about like what will Muslims in India have to do, they completely neglected this point. And that is why comparatively the state is a worse actor. What we told you, on the other hand, is that we want a regulated market. We want efficient output which can elevate people out of poverty. We want people to achieve their full potential through proper allocation of resources. And we want, and this is most importantly, to have higher tax revenue and offer targeted help, to not have an overburdened state, a state that has too much on its back, a state whose back will fundamentally break. But then secondly, where do individuals make better decisions? Because Victor tells you about why private ownership like enforces responsibility, why in the developing world, the lack of private ownership leads to an overexploitation of land, and that literally means famines, right? Why like houses in China fall apart after 50 years, and why they bring bridges to nowhere. Note like how little they have actually done to respond to that. Because we have more money, more targeted help, and more economic growth, you should vote side opposition.
Cadlap, thanks. Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I'd like to call upon the proposition reply to close out the case for Team Scotland and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
That COVID line at the beginning of the last reply speech was really interesting to me, given that it seems that in terms of global responses to the pandemic, it has been much better dealt with by countries which have much more state involvement in the healthcare system, like Cuba and Vietnam, than those with much less state involvement in the healthcare system, like the United States and Brazil. you know, interesting case study from side opposition there coming out right at the end of their case. But regardless, I think that there are two questions that are really important when we are judging this debate. Firstly, is the free market, opposition's counter-mech, an effective distributor of land? And secondly, how likely are governments to be good landlords under our side of the house? So firstly, let's look at this idea about, is the free market an effective distributor of land? First thing was a disagreement here about what we mean by effective, right? Because on opposition, we kind of get this idea that the only reason that land can possibly be effective is that it caters to private interests really well, and there's lots of like economic growth and business and everything happening here. We were much more nuanced on side proposition, right? We told you that effective land distribution only happens when it also has good externalities, because that's, you know, an external thing that affects everyone in society rather than the few people actually using a plot of land. And secondly, provision for the impoverished, again, a really, really important thing when we're talking about our reduction of homelessness, right? We cared much more about those, but Scotland was also so much more convincing on the Czech Republic's own metric because of substantive that we brought to you in both of our first two speeches. More on that in a second. So, right, what was opposition's metric for distribution? We are told that there is this price mechanism where landlords have so much more information because they're so much more interested, and that leads to this really efficient, cost-effective industry. Okay, where did we show a fault of information on behalf of landlords? We think we showed this the second we told you about the fact that landlords just don't have access to all of the information wider on a more societal level about what's going on in terms of trends, about what's going on in terms of like, you know, social housing and provision and all that kind of thing. At that point, we just don't think they're that effective an actor in that case. But thirdly, why was our analysis more likely and more impactful when we're talking about effectiveness? Because we told you really, really impactful things about externalities, right? We gave you this very clear distinction about the fact that governments need to cater to voters. They need to cater to the interests of wider society, whereas landlords only need to cater to themselves. At that point, we get things like climate change, right? We told you 3 reasons as to why, at least, as to why governments are so much more like predisposed to tackling climate change than private companies. The only response we got from opposition here was that like private companies will just destroy their own land if they know they'll give it up. We found this really quite uncomparative, right? Because we told you reasons as to why governments can bake environmental protections into lease conditions and cancel contracts. We also told you why it just makes absolutely no sense for a company to say that they want to make themselves really unpleasant in the eyes of the government and probably never get a lease renewed and never get more land, right? We just didn't really buy that. Secondly, we told you about infrastructure and all the barriers that exist there under the status quo and why that gets so much better under our side. In terms of provision for the poor, we gave you so many reasons as to why the government is so much better at judging what poor people need and how to react to that, right? We told you about generational wealth. We told you about spatial inequality. We told you about gentrification. We told you about loans. We told you about all sorts of things, none of which side opposition have really spent much time responding to, right? But then let's look at their own metric about holistic economic development, because we still don't have much response to when we tell you that when the state decreases rent, it gives more money to people to actually spend rather than giving that money to landlords who just hoard it, right? Then we told you that the economic crisis can literally only happen with housing bubbles, right? It is a necessary condition to wreck the global economy. We also told you about why infrastructure is such a wasted potential under their side of the house, and why it's just so much better under our side when the government has more control of infrastructure, because that is vital to running any economy, right? At this point, we showed that any private ownership of land is at best a missed opportunity and at worst an active harm. That is why we are justified in telling you that we need to make all land public. It was because we told you this, and it was because we told you all these things about governments just being so much better faith actors than private companies, and it was because we never got reasons as to why a private individual actually cares about the greater good that Scotland won this debate.
Okay, thanks very much for that fine speech, and indeed all speakers for their contributions today. I will now send my message out into the ether and see if they will take us away from you for a while to make our decision. We are in A16.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, you now speak for Team Scotland. You are responsible for all things that happen from here. Team Czech Republic, are you here, everyone?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. I think I am going to get to the decision quite quickly, but I will say just a bit of general feedback. I think this is a perfect example of both the strengths and sometimes the challenges of pre-prepared debates. But I'll get into that a little bit more. Some of the research was brilliant, but I think as a result, and part of the difficulty we had in reaching a decision was about the extent to which teams are able to move out of their own frame of the debate to really engage with the world the other team was setting up and the terms they were setting out, which meant this debate was very complex, lots of material. But in terms of the decision, I will tell you that it was a split decision. And ultimately, it was a 2-1 victory for the proposition team Scotland. Congratulations to them and commiserations to Team Czech Republic. As I said, we all felt this was an incredibly close debate and quite a complex one. So trying to break this down in terms of both the split and the rationale, we broadly saw 3 broad areas of clash come out in the debate. The first was who is best placed to allocate land. Secondly, who will ensure the use of that land is better. And then finally, there was these sort of ideas of debt and long-term development. Now, at the beginning of this debate, Scotland set this debate up very clearly in the context of a housing crisis. Land is not making its way into the hands of the homeless, of the poor. It is therefore getting into a cycle in which the poor can never escape, the rich get richer, and land is not being used well enough. They gave us this very basic model, but I think perfectly acceptable model, distribution based essentially on need. Governments charge rent and a short-term lease model. We felt the first prop was able to show quite well how this would actually result in more people ultimately, quite simply, getting access to land, getting access to home. Now, where we immediately saw a difference was that the broad approach of the opposition team, Czech Republic, was taking a very different angle on this debate. Rather than focusing very specifically on sort of housing, was taking a much sort of wider view of land usage, and the role that markets play generally in fueling the economy through land, through markets. So how do we decide what happened here? We felt there were a number of different things that came out of this broad issue. So we had the issue of the influence of lobbying. We have issues of who is going to look after minority interests, etc. And what we felt, though, the majority of judges felt that while there was a lot of interplay on a lot of these small issues, and whilst there was an attempt by the opposition to cross over and explore these sort of alternatives of the building of housing, what we never really felt that we got enough of from the opposition was what's the link between a market force and the role of the market in filling an apparent gap and an apparent need within the broad land market in terms of their capacity to provide for housing, to provide for people outside of a basic desire and need for profit. How are they going to deal with things like intergenerational land transfer? How are they going to deal with the ideas of the rich being able to sit on land and accrue wealth? Now, we felt that there was an attempt in terms of things like, if it gets really bad, we'll allow for social housing. We had this idea of the increase in property tax. But what we felt was not, and what we needed more of from the opposition was what the links were between not just how are we going to plug a gap in a market where there's a problem with it, but also how broadly is the market, this great actor you're asserting was going to build the economy, going to be able to provide in a context where demonstrably both teams seem to accept that this gap currently existed. And while we also felt there was some power that prop were able to exert by sort of going, hold on, if the market is so great, if private interest is so good, if the government is such a bad actor, falling back and relying on it to plug all the gaps in your market undermines some of the very strength of the power of things like profit motive to fill in the gaps that have become apparent. Now, that being said, we do think this was an incredibly close issue. All judges agreed on that. And that was in part because we felt on proposition, a lot of the best material that came out on this came out relatively early. And while not completely dropped, wasn't really defended as much as it could have been down the table. And whilst, as I said, we felt that opposition were able to sort of chip away and mitigate aspects of it, by the end, there was enough of that still standing, as a majority of us felt, to mean that ultimately the prop were very able to cover this. Now, that wasn't universal. A couple of the judges felt that, one judge felt that actually this was essentially a wash on both sides, and one judge who was not actually casting a ballot but was in the room actually felt that this issue of minorities was a really big issue in the debate, and ultimately one that carried for the opposition. But most of us, the majority of us, felt that that point, it went backwards and forwards, but ultimately we weren't convinced as that sub point that any one team was really able to really grasp that point in terms of showing how either the government as actor or the market as actor was demonstrably better or worse than the other. We think both teams made brief attempts at it, but neither team was able to carry that. Because as I said, one judge felt that was relatively decisive in that overall issue of allocation of land. In terms of the second broad issue of who will use the land in the best manner. Now, this is where we felt there was the majority of it, in fact, all of us pretty much felt that this is where the least crossover really, really happened in this debate. And we think that actually there could have been more from both teams in terms of the comparative of the framing, because we had a proposition who was talking about long-term planning and that being really, really essential, and an op talking about how we want to maximize profit and that that's the best way to work things. But ultimately, whilst one judge did feel that the opposition was able to better show the extent of private interests, willingness and requirement to have certainty and to want to invest in own land in order to develop, the majority of us felt that actually the proposition were able to show that their scheme would be able to ultimately balance the needs in terms of allowing enough incentive for long-term development of this land, long-term development through renewal of leases, the ability to still contain the crops, and all of those things that you get by exploiting the land, but also being able to show they would be able to avoid the worst excesses of a market that like to do things like sit on the land and simply wait till it accrues value, and thereby squeezing out other actors who would be able to use that land more effectively. And then there was this final issue of debt and long-term development. Now, this is where, when I pointed out the strengths and sometimes challenges of this format, we felt that on both sides, while this argument firstly about the housing bubble and the long-term crash, and then secondly about long-term development, reallocation of resources into the economy, both teams left these ideas quite late, and thus they weren't really able to be super decisive in the debate. Now, the measure of their decisiveness did come, was sort of an issue of some contention. But what we all agreed was both of these ideas were somewhat abstract in their construction, and actually bringing those down to earth a little bit more, making those ideas feel a bit more real and grounded in a context where we're talking about very real and very apparent issues, would have really benefited either team in terms of showing the consequences of either one of the perceptions of those two ideas actually coming to bear. So as I said, for the majority of us, that was sort of a wash. One judge felt it was relatively decisive and had been won by the proposition, but ultimately felt that as a whole, the debate had still gone to op, whereas the majority of us who went for proposition didn't really feel that this point was allowed to have the kind of impact to sway based on the sort of the power of those first two broader areas we felt was more decisive. So that's it for the decision.